Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Blake Johnson. In this week's episode, Theresa Cardinal Brown is joined by guest Doris Meissner, Senior Fellow and Director of U.S. Immigration Policy at the Migration Policy Institute, and Ruth Wasem, BPC Fellow and Professor of Public Policy Practice at the University of Texas at Austin. They'll be discussing their new report for MPI entitled Toward a Better Immigration System, Fixing Immigration Governance at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. In the report, which was released earlier this month, Doris and Ruth mapped the institutional structures of DHS and the challenges of interdepartmental collaboration in managing the U.S. immigration system. The authors also provided some recommendations and actions for the executive branch. As always, you can find Theresa on Twitter at BPC_T Brown. Ruth is also on Twitter at RE Wasem. An exciting episode ahead, so stick around.
Thank you, Blake. We are indeed very pleased to welcome BPC Fellow and frequent guest of the podcast, Ruth Wasem, and for the first time, Doris Meissner, well known to many in the immigration community, a former commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service during the Clinton administration, and a longtime senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute. Ruth and Doris, welcome to This Week in Immigration.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Blake mentioned a little bit about your report. It's called Toward a Better Immigration System, Fixing Immigration Governance at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And Doris, I'm going to start with you first. What was the genesis for this report that looks at the organization of the Department of Homeland Security and its immigration management functions? What drove you to do this in the first place?
Well, this is part of a long-standing project that we have going on at MPI that we call Rethinking U.S. Immigration Policy. It's a project that began several years ago, and we're looking at various aspects of the immigration system, trying to do as deep a dive as we can into what their issues are, what might change, etc. And in the process of doing that, normally we've been looking at things like the border or the detention system or the asylum system, but we've also been, in the process, concerned about how it is that changes are implemented, if changes indeed are made. And that, of course, has been underscored by the fact of the new administration, the Biden administration, coming in with such ambitious plans for possible legislation and other changes. But the question then is, if any of those changes were made, does the government have the wherewithal to execute? And so as part of this Rethinking U.S. Immigration Policy, one of our issues to look at carefully has been the Department of Homeland Security, the governance of the immigration system, and that's what brought us to doing this report. Now, this report looks only at what can be done by the executive branch through executive authority. And I want to make that clear from the outset, because there's a lot of work and discussion about DHS 20 years later, the different way the threat environment has changed, etc. And I imagine we'll get into some of that. But our premise here has been that in the near term, any kinds of changes at the Department of Homeland Security or in the way in which it operates would be limited to what the executive branch can do because of the paralysis that exists in the Congress and the unlikelihood of the Congress doing the kinds of bigger things that might be needed, but that we're not approaching in this work.
So let me ask, according to the report, what do you think are the key failings of DHS when it comes to managing the immigration system today?
Well, I think that the key failings are pretty much baked into the creation of DHS, which is that it is a creature of the post 9/11 period, obviously, and it is intended to deal with the national security challenges facing the country. And so by putting immigration agency, what had been one agency, the INS, into the Department of Homeland Security, but also bringing some others in, for instance, the Customs Service, and dividing those functions up. The lens has been national security. And certainly national security is an important part of immigration work and the missions of the immigration agencies, but it's not the only. And so the key failing to me is too narrow a focus for the work that the USCIS, ICE, CBP do, and also the way in which the department as a department defines immigration. And then beyond that, of course, there are failings that simply have to do with the structures of the agency, the funding, the professionalism. But I think, to me, the biggest difficulty is the national security lens and its limitations.
So, Ruth, let me bring you in here. You observed and reported on the creation of DHS while you were working at the Congressional Research Service. From your recollection, what were the key factors in the creation of DHS and its immigration functions? And do you remember whether you or any of your colleagues maybe highlighted potential concerns with that, or whether members of Congress did? What do you recall from that time when it was coming together?
Well, there's two things to bear in mind when the department was created and the relationship with immigration. One is that there was already underway a major overall haul of how the Immigration and Naturalization Service was structured. Some of that was being done internally by the executive branch, but there was also legislation that was had been moving along under consideration with a fair amount of support to restructure the Immigration Service at that time. So that was already on the table. When you bring in 9/11 and the national security pressures and the fact that it was foreign nationals who led the terrorist attack on the United States at that point in time, it was pretty clear that at least the immigration enforcement functions were going to be moved in the new department. Now, there was a lot of things floating around then. There was talk. In fact, some of the bills had the Department of State's visa function also going to Homeland Security. There was a version that left what we now call U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services in the Department of Justice. So it was not altogether clear as this moved along what would be what of the various immigration responsibilities and functions would actually be included in the department. But at the end of the day, it ended up being all of the old Immigration and Naturalization Service functions. The Justice Department did keep, and of course, the Department of Justice is where INS resided previously. The Justice Department did keep the immigration courts, and the State Department kept the visa functions, and unaccompanied children duties were transferred to the Department of Homeland Security. So there were some other things that moved around, but DHS got the old INS, and that meant it was one of that along with FEMA and TSA, these were the big components of the new department. The largest single appropriations were coming from these agencies. So it was an important part of the new department. You also asked, did any of us have concerns? And I must say, of course, whenever something new is created under the kind of crisis that the nation was feeling after 9/11, and the various government agencies were juggling their responses, particularly the intelligence community, there were concerns. And I did a report in 2005, just 2 years after the creation of the department, looking at how the immigration functions were being managed in the new department because they were folded in with customs, and it was unclear, particularly in the early days, whether the immigration responsibilities were getting appropriate attention.
So I recall very, very clearly at the time that the actual act, you mentioned FEMA and TSA, I mean, they moved into the department as whole entities, as did Secret Service, as did Coast Guard. INS didn't move over intact, though. INS was officially abolished. There was a phrase in the act that said the Immigration Administration Service is abolished and broken up. And there were initially, I think, 2 agencies that were supposed to exist. And one was the Immigration Benefits Agency, Citizenship and Immigration Services. The other was a Border and Transportation Agency that ended up being divided too into CBP and ICE. Doris, I mean, you were a commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. You sort of saw how your agency got parceled out here. It ended up with some redundant functions and different things. It didn't come apart cleanly, did it? Like what did you, when you were looking at those kind of things, like what happened to the legacy INS and where it went and what it evolved into? What all did you see there in terms of where different functions went and whether there were redundancies created?
Well, of course, the big critique of INS at the time, prior to the creation of DHS, was the critique that the enforcement and the service functions were in conflict with each other. And as Ruth referred to, this is not a new issue that just came up after 9/11. This is an issue that had been in dispute for many years, and there had been efforts by Congress and others to reorganize the agency. And I was there in the 1990s. We were making proposals as well for how to resolve or respond to that critique. So that was as much as anything, I believe, the driving idea when 9/11 and the post 9/11 period created this imperative that the immigration functions be moved into a Homeland Security setting because the hijackers came with visas. And so the dividing up of the functions really just was part of a long story that benefits had to be on one side and enforcement had to be on another side. Now, one of the ironies of all of this is that the people that really wanted more and the interests that were so strongly in favor of a benefit function existing independent of the enforcement functions so certainly won the day at that time by the creation of USCIS as a self-standing component and by it reporting in directly to the deputy secretary, arguably at a level higher in the bureaucratic hierarchy than the enforcement functions. But of course, what we see today is an agency or a DHS and components where I think it's fair to say that USCIS does more enforcement than ever was the case when it was part of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Now, that goes, of course, to the issue that these functions are all connected. And even though you can divide them up, what Congress was looking for and what it achieved, by and large, was for the enforcement functions of the immigration enterprise to fully maximize. They really were not interested at that time in balancing these these differing dimensions of the immigration system. And that goes, I think, to what the problems are and what some of the failings or difficulties or gaps are in what we've seen since, in that these things really are, one has to think of these as aspects of a continuum. We call it in this report a system because it is a system. And so even though the agencies were divided up, they need to have real interaction. And the Congress, in trying to achieve real self-standing enforcement functions that were not mitigated by other considerations, Congress actually succeeded in that, because that is what we see with CBP and with ICE.
So let me dive into it a little bit. Also, Ruth, you said you wrote a paper in 2005 looking at this. I joined DHS in 2005, and the first thing that then Secretary Chertoff tried to do was restructure everything. And one of the things he did, as Doris mentioned, USCIS at the time was reporting to the Deputy Secretary, but CBP and ICE, which had been made separate agencies were both reporting to an undersecretary for Border and Transportation Security along with TSA. Well, that position was gone away with, and then they created an Office of Policy, and suddenly everybody was reporting up, but that coordination mechanism got lost. Was that something that you looked at back then? Was that one of the recommendations maybe that the secretary looked at when he was making that reorganization? I mean, there's a new policy office that hadn't been put into statute. It wasn't part of the Homeland Security Act, but not sure how well that office coordinated policy. What kind of things did you see from those reorganizations?
Well, if you're talking about 15 years ago, in looking at that, it made some sense to have the 6 major agencies in DHS all on a level playing field, but losing that coordinative function meant that everything would ultimately go to the secretary. And that enabled some of the agencies to be self-maximizing in terms of how they functioned. There wasn't a buffer, there wasn't somebody looking over. Now, in that policy role, there were times when there were stronger personalities in it, more forceful leaders who could exert influence if they had that kind of recognition within the department and with the secretary. The other issue with the role of the Assistant Secretary for Border and Transportation Security was that USCIS was not part of that. And under the statute as it's currently written, that was one of the things we looked at in our report, putting those agencies back together under a single chain of command is not allowed under the Homeland Security Act. Because of what Doris mentioned earlier of the strong desire to keep immigration benefits and services separate from the enforcement side. As a result, that does limit some of the ways a Secretary of Homeland Security can configure the chain of command. And that's why in the report, I'd like to think Doris and I were fairly creative in looking at who's there already existing in statute that can play that role of creating an atmosphere where an immigration systems approach can flourish, or at least be nurtured and develop.
Well, I mean, I think what we're hearing is that, INS was a single entity, and whether or not you thought it was overly imbalanced toward enforcement or toward benefits, at least it was a single entity. And it, when it was put into DHS and then eventually divided into 2 and then 3, those functions didn't cleanly sever, right? There, as you said, like there is interaction, particularly CBP and ICE. I think that both those agencies got part of Customs and part of INS. USCIS was, I think, almost entirely former INS people that made up USCIS. But those functions don't cleanly separate in the immigration system. And the other thing is that, Doris, you kind of mentioned this enforcement mentality may have been overwhelming of benefit mentality. That's about culture, right? That's about, what's the culture of the place. I will be perfectly upfront. When I was at DHS, there were some in the immigration system at DHS who saw USCIS as the nice place. That's what they called it. USCIS was the nice place, and CBP and ICE were not the nice place. What is it about the culture of these agencies that has evolved now that they've been separated? And what kind of cultural change do you talk about, the need for a better institutional culture? What do you think that means?
I think so much of what the culture of the immigration agencies is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, if you're a person that is strongly in favor of strong immigration enforcement, members of Congress, etc., then DHS and the enforcement parts of DHS, ICE, and CBP are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. If you're a person that, travels to the United States and gets pulled out of the visa line, or somebody that is, pursuing a naturalization complicated case, you view the culture as highly as not customer friendly, as abusive, and certainly if you're somebody that lived in Portland, Oregon a year ago under a prior administration when INS was asked to go in anti-riot terms, you have an even further view of the culture of the agency because of the way that it was, frankly, misused and politicized over prior years. So, to me, the issue here is not to try to so much point fingers about what's an enforcement culture, what's a nice guy culture, et cetera, et cetera. It really is professionalism. And the question of professionalism for government services and government responsibilities that have been pushed pendulum wide through for years and years and years, and certainly since DHS has been created. The thing I think that we've seen is that, again, as you said, whatever the issues were with INS, and there certainly were issues, the people that were in the career service in INS learned all the different parts of the system. And we, of course, make a very big point in this report about the importance of viewing this immigration enterprise as a system. And it might at one point have been a system that by and large existed on the functions that are in DHS. It's now one that is not only the DHS functions, but also functions in HHS, in the State Department, now, as we see with Afghan evacuees, even coordination with the Defense Department. So it's looking at this as a system that is the real challenge for government, both DHS as the lead agency and government overall, and any administration and whatever its agenda might be. The difficulty with its performing as a system is not only leadership and policy and acutely important, difficult coordination challenges within intra and interdepartmental. It is also that the career service, the senior career service, which goes to this issue of culture that you raised, really is not trained anymore in the overall functions of the system. People, and that's particularly the case in ICE and in CBP. It is not so much the case in USCIS. In USCIS, you do have more legacy INS staff who did work in the different parts of the system and understand it. But in CBP and in ICE, partly because they're enforcement agencies, retirement ages are younger, they spend less time in the career service. The hiring has been far more aggressive just in terms of the growth of the staff, so that the dominant critical mass of people are new, and all they know is that function, the border enforcement function or the ICE interior enforcement function. And that has led both to stovepiping of the agencies as agencies, but also to this issue of institutional culture being quite narrowly focused.
Yeah, I just share another anecdote from my tenure there. When I arrived at CBP in 2005, it was very common in the halls for people to ask what legacy agency somebody was from. Are you legacy INS? Are you legacy customs? And at CBP at the time, far more legacy customs people than INS. And at ICE, similarly, although the ERO function was kind of big over there. At USCIS, as you mentioned, it was all INS people. But the other focus at CBP in that early days was really combining that customs and immigration cultures together. And it was overwhelmingly customs at that time. Border Patrol maintained its own identity. But there was also this idea that the cross-training was to cross-train those frontline officers in customs law as well as immigration, not necessarily the whole immigration system. They suddenly had to learn a whole other set of laws that they weren't necessarily familiar with and weren't necessarily used to do. So that took a lot of attention in the first few years that I was there, from 2005 to 2008. By the time I left in 2011, though, that legacy question, who did you belong to? Nobody asks that anymore. Everybody is, I'm CBP, I'm ICE, I'm USCIS, they identified by. So, the culture can evolve. It evolves in different ways. But I think some of it was that design. It was a forced merger between Customs and INS at that time for CBP and ICE. And that was the struggle. And I think you're right. Along the way, they kind of lost that link to the other parts of the immigration system. Ruth, I wanted to ask you, one of the big sections in the report looks at the budgets for the agencies, right? And I imagine you did a lot of work looking at agency budgets over the years. One of the things the report recommends is a more consolidated budget process throughout the agencies, particularly for the immigration functions, because they're interrelated. What are the key insights you found from looking at the agency budgets and how they have evolved over the years? And why do you think consolidated budgeting is so important for the immigration mission?
It wasn't a surprise that CBP has been able to achieve robust funding. So looking at those budget figures and seeing that the support and the resources they've gotten is not surprising. But when you have a situation where and ICE, as you know, Theresa, struggled in the early years to even have funding, because it was pretty clear where those types of enforcement activities were getting their funding in the past, and it wasn't. So they really struggled, but they have literally scraped and fought to get resources for their functions, and it became and USCIS is funded by fees. Overwhelmingly, just a small amount of appropriated public monies. It's overwhelmingly a fee-based agency. So you have three very different trajectories going on in the funding, and it's the pressure. So the border agencies get robust funding, but if they get a lot of funding, all the other whether it's ICE dealing with detaining the people that the Border Patrol have apprehended, whether it's USCIS processing asylum seekers through the asylum course, whether it's the Department of Justice judges or HHS's unaccompanied children, all of these other agencies are directly affected by increased and enhanced performance of CBP. And if they don't get commensurate funding, you start to have a lot of bottlenecks and you have dysfunction. Of course, it's, and that's, they're clearly not solely the result of this, but this is exacerbating these issues. So having a coordinated management and oversight of these budgets, and I don't blame. If I were the head of CBP or the head of ICE, I'd be there arguing for as much money as I could get. But that's why someone has to have the perspective of what does the overall system need, and coordinating these things and figuring out how you can adequately staff across these agencies, and setting up a system both with the Undersecretary for Management, but also policy. If you're going to be making policy changes or you anticipate things happening, having a system that's coordinated and has that agility to be responsive in what we are now seeing seems to be an endless set of crises. And that you need to have a cross-agency coordination in order to have the resources at hand, to not have an agency with an important role in that pipeline not have the resources to proceed.
Yeah. Now, I know Doris made the disclaimer at the front that your report only looks at things that the executive branch can do on its own, but I have to point some fingers back at Congress here, right? You just mentioned there are 3 separate cabinet agencies, 4, if you think about it, that have immigration responsibilities: DHS, DOJ, State Department, and HHS. Guess what? every one of those is a separate appropriations bill in Congress that goes through a separate committee. And we just saw today the nominee for the new CBP commissioner had his hearing before not the Senate Judiciary Committee or not even the Senate Homeland Security Committee, but the Senate Finance Committee that had legacy jurisdiction over U.S. Customs. And Chairman Wyden opened the hearing by saying, like, I know we don't usually deal with immigration. Fully 80% of the questions to the nominee were about the border or immigration. So, I mean, did your report address this discrepancy at all about the oversight responsibilities in Congress and how that may contribute to the dysfunction that we see in the immigration system? Do you think this issue of diverse congressional oversight has really impacted how these agencies have evolved?
Yes, we do think it's impacted them, and we do.
I teed that up well, didn't I?
Right, exactly. And the best that we can do, because if we think it's difficult to imagine that the Congress is going to make structural changes in DHS, the idea that the Congress is going to make structural changes in its own organization and oversight roles and assignments is an even further stretch. So the most likely thing that can be done that we believe perhaps helps is for the executive branch itself to put together consolidated budgets that then go with one voice to all these various committees so that at least there is an administration position that integrates effectively. And then we have recommendations on how that could happen.
Yeah, Ruth, what about you? There were lots of discussions about this initially, and then they kind of faded off the table.
Yeah, there were a lot of discussions, but it's not unique to Homeland Security. If you look at the Department of Energy, which is a relatively modern department, it faces the same set of issues. I tried to see how unique is this. Department of Energy, goes before obviously Energy and Natural Resources in the Senate and Energy and Commerce in the House, but it also has some of its jurisdiction is armed services and military affairs. It's goes before the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee. Homeland Security has a dog in that fight. House Natural Resources. Even Indian Affairs has a piece of the Department of Energy. And so this issue of multiple jurisdictions for a department is part of a broader way that Congress is organized. And while it is a factor in or a challenge, it's something that many departments have to deal with. We looked at the FBI and how many different committees they have to testify before, and this is typical. And as committees spend more time in hearings and oversight and less time in legislating, I would presume the number of required testimonies and hearings is only going to increase. So
Doris, let's get to some of this. You talked a little bit about some of the recommendations. There are a total of 17 recommendations in this report, and I will encourage our readers to go find it on the Migration Policy Institute website. But what do you think of these 17 recommendations are the most critical that would make the biggest difference or should be taken care of first?
Well, we make the case that this is a system and it needs to be managed as a system. And so simply grappling with what that actually means is an important place to start on recommendations. What we say is that the best way for the Department of Homeland Security to truly serve as the lead agency in the federal government on immigration issues, which is what it is supposed to do, even though it isn't the sole one, is for it to get its own coordination, to strengthen its own coordination internally. And we think that the best hope for that and the best place for that is a reasonably new position that was created by the Congress in 2016, which is an undersecretary for policy and plans and strategy, I think is what it's called. And that is a function that was not really developed institutionally. In the period after Congress created it. There is an opportunity now for it, in fact, to be empowered. But it can only be effective if it's empowered by the secretary and deputy secretary to truly play a coordinating role. Interestingly, that position by statute has to be filled by a career person, which makes it a little bit more difficult simply because, it's perfectly doable, but as a new direction, it's a little harder. But that undersecretary is on the same level bureaucratically as the commissioner of CBP, the director of ICE, and the assistant secretary of ICE, and the director of USCIS. So that's the proper level in the hierarchy for true coordination to go on. And we're not in any way saying that job and that person and that structure, which has an assistant secretary under it for borders and management and 2 other assistant secretaries that are relevant, that should be micromanaging. It shouldn't. It should be coordinating. It should be looking at strategic planning. It should be looking at executing. And it should, importantly, staff out the issues that are going to the secretary and deputy secretary for decision so that, in fact, things are fully developed before, as decisions are made. Now, that's hard to achieve right now because you don't even have the component heads in place. And so one has to really be quite sympathetic about the handicaps that the current appointees face without having, their full complement on staff. But longer term, that is the place for coordination to occur. Then in addition to that, we do talk about the budgets. We talk about a way in which the Undersecretary for Management, which is another very important and senior level position in DHS, can bring about the kind of consolidated budget work that we've just discussed. We talk about the individual agencies and evening out their budgets. We talk about how to handle the border more effectively in terms of creating an infrastructure and facilities at the border that are suited to the current flows. CBP is very behind in its infrastructure in not really grasping the shift to a protection and largely Central American flow. It still is set up and designed for, young male Mexican males. We talk about institutional culture from the standpoint of in some ways trying to reduce the incredible policy swings that have taken place over the years. And we say very clearly that the only answer for that ultimately is Congress, that so much of what the difficulties are with the professionalism at DHS do have to do with the fact that people are being asked to enforce laws that are disconnected from reality on the ground. And that as long as you have that, there are going to be perversities that take place. So, and we also talk about the fact that DHS is an agency that has a very weak overall structure from the Secretary's office. We compare it to the State Department, some of the more mature agencies in the federal government, which have much better resourced department-wide functions. And we think that this undersecretary idea, strengthening it, helps with that, but it's also a budget issue, that budgets being put money almost entirely into the component agencies rather than into the overall department-wide structures continues centrifugal forces that work in the wrong direction. So there are others. They're all along the lines of management kinds of changes that can be made by the executive branch.
I'll just say, my career at DHS, I served longest under the director of the Office of Policy before it was statutorily authorized. One of the things that we used to joke about is our job was to coordinate the components to the extent that they are willing to be coordinated. So my first job was to convince them that they should be coordinated. Other departments like State Department or DOD the secretary has said, you go through them before you come to me. It is a line authority. They are given direction. So it sounds like that's the kind of thing that you're talking about reinstituting for DHS, that the secretary empowers the policy office to be that coordinating entity, requires the components to coordinate with them. And I think that would be helpful. But you did also mention it gets back to Congress. So Ruth, I come back to you as our congressional expert. What's amazing to me is that the Homeland Security Act was passed in 2002. It wasn't until 2016 that another authorizing statute for the Department of Homeland Security actually was passed. You know, we have an annual defense authorization process. You know, do you think that that's part of the issue that could be done? I mean, obviously there's immigration policy, but in terms of structure for the department, having that kind of an authorization bill that can enforce some of these structures that you see, do you think that's a possibility?
Well, I'm not sure because when you look at what the authorization for Homeland Security includes, it really is mostly the organizational aspects of the department. It begs your earlier question about all the different committees that have jurisdiction. So judiciary subcommittees on immigration, they control immigration policy. There's the Coast Guard has, there are subcommittees, all of emergency management, FEMA. Other committees do a lot of the what we would consider the programmatic authorizing of most of the Department of Homeland Security's functions. So it gets back to that. And I think that probably what's key is the Committee on Homeland Security embracing an immigration systems approach. That would be what I would like to see them approach that. I think similarly across some of the other functions in the department, we're already seeing a shift in Homeland Security as the terrorist threat, and many others have written about this. So this is not a new idea, but as it shifts from foreign threats to domestic threats, the balance in the department, the priorities, the tasks for it are shifting. And I think that must give the Department of Homeland Security and its authorizing committee pause about how much change do you want to make? Waiting as long as they did before they did a significant reauthorization, to me, was just trying to give a startup agency the chance to develop its own legs and to learn how to do things. And tinkering too much and changing too much when a department is brand new would, even if there might have been reasons to do it, there were certainly arguments against it. The department is now getting a maturity where more regular authorization legislation may indeed be in order.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining us on This Week in Immigration. This is a very important report. I think that anybody who works in the immigration space on policy has to understand how those policies are implemented at the agencies and the departments. And I think it's important that you've taken this look at this. So thank you very much for joining us and sharing your insights with us on This Week in Immigration.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
And that's it for our show this week. One last reminder to rate, subscribe, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discussed here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow us on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. I'm Blake Johnson. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Theresa Cardinal Brown, Siddiq Nepal, and myself. Ethan Plotkin produces and edits our show. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.